case for the Iraq war. A public inquiry into the UK's role in the war on Iraq opens in London, with top officials taking the stand. Can the truth be known and lessons learned without hurting British interests, boosting war opposition and damaging transatlantic relations? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. Why did Britain go to war against Iraq, and was it legal? These are some of the many questions an inquiry in London is looking into. The investigation that officially began in July had its first public hearings on Tuesday. Set up by the government, the 5-member panel is headed by Sir John Chilcot, who has promised a full and insightful account. Top civil servants, including former Prime Minister Tony Blair, will be among those who will be questioned. The inquiry is expected to look at events between 2001 and 2009, covering how and why the UK joined the war, where the troops were properly prepared, and what was planned for its aftermath. While Britain formally ended its combat operations in Iraq in April this year, these questions have stirred quite a lot of controversy, as you can imagine. Since the American-led invasion in March 2003, 179 British soldiers have been killed. It has cost the British taxpayer approximately $10 billion over 6 years. That equates to about $166 for every man, woman and child in the country. About 7 months before the actual invasion of Iraq in September 2002, Britain published a dossier outlining the threat posed by Iraq. It claimed Iraq's leader, Saddam Hussein, had weapons of mass destruction, which could be used within 45 minutes of him giving an order. And so, in March 2003, 40,000 British soldiers partook in a mission that involved taking over Basra, Iraq's second largest city. 3 months later, that number dropped to 18,000 after the then US President George Bush announced the mission had been accomplished. 4 years on, in February 2007, Tony Blair, who was British Prime Minister at the time, announced a phased withdrawal of British forces. Eventually, in December that year, Basra was officially handed over to the Iraqis, but British troops were forced to re-intervene in March 2008 against militants in Basra. In December 2008, United Nations Security Council Resolution 1790, which provided the British military's mandate to remain in Iraq, expired. It was then replaced by a new agreement between the UK and the Iraqi governments. It was only in April this year that Britain ended its combat operations in the country. Most of its 4,000 troops returned home, leaving behind only some 400 personnel to train the Iraqi Navy. Joining us now in London are our guests to discuss this further. Jeremy Corbyn, Labour Party representative in the British Parliament. Also joining us, David Cole, Managing Director of the Atlantic Council, a think tank focusing on international affairs. And finally, SABAH Al-MUKHTAR, President of the Arab Lawyers Association. Mr. Al-MUKHTAR, is this inquiry anything other than a cover-up?
No, it isn't, because if you have a situation where somebody is accused of having broken the law or committed a crime, you would start a judicial inquiry. So if somebody accuses me of theft, then you would call the police in. They may find me not guilty, they may not put me on trial, but that is what you require, not a public inquiry which is held in secret, which is a strange use of the terminology, a public in secret inquiry. This is an inquiry which is headed by the respected Sir John Chilcot, who's a senior civil servant. Nevertheless, it's not a judicial one. The remit of the inquiry is very limited. It's very limiting. It's like asking your auditor to check the receipts and the accounts, but not to look at the probity of the expenditure or the income. So, of course, it is a whitewash. It is going to be a whitewash. This is how the families of those who have fallen in Iraq, and it is incumbent on this government to actually tell them why did the government send those people to their death, not in defense of Queen and country, but they have sent them to death on a political wish, as was dictated by the government. And now the government is being accused, both the leaders and the party, of having misled Parliament, misled the public, and they have gone on a mission which I must say that your report gave all the figures, but it forgot to mention that there are 500,000 orphans in Iraq, there are 500,000 widows in Iraq, there are 4 million Iraqis who are refugees in other countries, and there are probably something like 750,000 Iraqis who were killed. The inquiry is not concerned with any of those people. Mr.
Corbyn, MUKHTAR is saying it's a cover-up, CHILCOT saying it's not a whitewash. What do you think it is?
I think it's an important step, but it's not as good as I would have hoped. I wanted a judicial inquiry like MUKHTAR did. I want it to be headed by a judge. I don't want it to be appointed by the Prime Minister with civil servants and others involved in it who themselves have been a party to policies in Iraq in the past. However, I do think it's important to participate in the inquiry. It's important to put evidence to it, and I hope that from this judicial actions will follow, because Parliament chose to mislead itself when Tony Blair made the case to go to war, and the successive parliamentary inquiries have been very soft affairs that haven't really got to the heart of the matter. The reality is, I believe, that Blair and Bush made a private agreement in April 2002 to undertake a military campaign in Iraq, and Parliament was suitably misled into this the following year, and as has been quite correctly pointed out, the tragedy of the deaths of well over 500,000 Iraqis, plus the tragedy of the internal exiles and the refugees and so on, and also of course the loss of British and American troops.
Mr. Cole, we've had inquiries before. The government, Tony Blair, were found to be innocent. I want to know from you how this is going to be any different, and what do you make of the panel? Out of the 5 on the panel, we've got Winston Churchill's biographer and an ex-British ambassador to Russia. Not one of them is a lawyer.
No. Starting with the second point, if you look back at the Franks report into the Falklands, there were people on there who were ex-ministers and so on that was criticised for being two-party political. What we're looking at here is a finding of fact inquiry, a lessons learned exercise, and so I think it is appropriate that the people on there are people who've got a track record of good analytical thinking. So I think the committee is appropriate. It's not going to give a single definitive answer. In fact, if it gave a single definitive answer into Iraq, it would be asking the wrong question, because it is such a long, complicated and involved issue that what we're looking for is a whole series of opinions and a whole series of questions that need to be first identified, then discussed and then answered. I know Mr. Corbyn and Mr. Al-Mukhtar are looking for other proceedings as a result of this. It's not an opinion I personally share, although I think going into Iraq was mistaken. Nevertheless, you have to have a basis of fact.
Sorry, excuse me, Mr. Cole. Let's touch on that. You say going to Iraq was a mistake. Do you think the British really felt that there was a terrorist threat against them emanating from Iraq?
Do you know, I think I would actually agree with what Robin Cook said in the House of Commons, that people in Britain didn't doubt that Saddam was a brutal dictator, but didn't think that he posed a clear and present danger to the United Kingdom. It was a threat to the region, a threat to stability, but no, I don't think people generally thought that he was a threat to the UK.
Because the former British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, who should be giving his evidence on Wednesday, and his government have been, in January, have been accused of misleading the British people into believing that there was an imminent threat from Iraq. Before the war, Tony Blair accused Iraq of producing and stockpiling chemical and biological weapons despite thorough inspections. He also said Iraq was actively trying to purchase uranium from Niger to relaunch its nuclear program. According to Blair, Saddam Hussein had some secret facilities to produce nuclear weapons. Blair's also been accused of manipulating the contents of an intelligence report which clearly stated the Iraqi regime would not resort to using weapons of mass destruction unless its survival was threatened. Mr. Corbyn, do you think that this has any chance of bringing Tony Blair down, of destroying his reputation?
Well, I think his reputation has already been incredibly tarnished and damaged by this. He was unsuccessful in trying to become president of the European Council because of his involvement with Iraq. I hope that when he gives evidence, he will be forced to tell us what he knew about Iraq before the inquiry, before the war started, what evidence he really had about Iraq's alleged intentions of mounting terrorist activities elsewhere, and of course the weapons of mass destruction issue.
But I mean, why should he do that?
In this and go to court.
Why should he do that? All the evidence and what we've just been reading seems to indicate that what he knew and what he told the public were two different things.
Well, I'd just like to have it confirmed by him, and I would also like CHILCOT to demand all papers that were prepared for the Cabinet shown to the Prime Minister, and those that were put before the Cabinet and those that were put before Parliament. I had a meeting with colleagues from Parliament with Hans Blix sometime afterwards. He had undertaken a very rigorous weapons inspection in Iraq and concluded that there was no threat from Iraq, as had Mohammed al-Baradei, and Blair chose to ignore that. Other governments listened to what Blix and al-Baradei said. For example, France and Germany listened and didn't take part in this illegal war. This is a very, very serious business. Now, this inquiry isn't going to solve the problem. It will help us on the way towards getting to know the absolute truth. It won't change what's happened in Iraq. It might mean that the politics of Britain changes and we don't so readily go to war on such nonsense, such dishonesty and such deception in the future. And Blair himself may well be culpable and brought before an international court as a result of this.
MUKHTAR, what do you in Iraq and your Iraqi clients hope to get out of this, according to what Tony Blair says and Gordon Brown when he takes a stand?
Well, obviously, I don't speak on behalf of anybody, but I don't think there is any hope that we will hear anything which is relevant to Iraq. This inquiry is concerned with the British side of the scene. It's looking at what the army did, what they didn't, did they have the right weapons, did the government tell the truth, did the soldiers die properly because they were given sufficient protection or not. The families of those who have fallen want answers. Why did their loved ones die? What did they die for? Was there any cause or not? As far as the Iraqis are concerned, I don't think there is anything that the inquiry is going to assist with. The Iraqis know very well what happened to them. They have paid the ultimate price on a variety of levels, from the state to the individuals, to the economy, to the whole thing. So it is, and this is not part of the remit of the inquiry. That's why when I said that the probity of the action is not being examined by the inquiry. However, I think this inquiry is very important, that in the sense that at the end of the day, we hope that all the various allegations, all the various accusations, all the various issues that people believe that the government have misled the people will be at least in one document, so that hopefully the Crown Prosecution Service may look at it and say, well, there is a prima facie case to have a judicial inquiry or to inquire from those people. Let's hope that this is something for that. The importance of that, again, is that for the rule of law, that Britain, which stands for the rule of law, must show the world that it doesn't have two laws, one for the Africans and the Asians and what have you, and the other one for the British. Politicians everywhere in the world, if they mislead their public, if they behave in an improper way, should face actual judicial inquiry. It is not only the weak ones, whether it's in Africa or anywhere else. So
Mr.
I think
Corbyn, I see you nodding your head there in agreement.
Well, absolutely, because politicians have got to face up to what actually happened and what decisions they were a party to. Many of my colleagues in Parliament chose to vote for the war in Iraq and chose to support Blair. They now bitterly regret it, but they should answer for what they did. Now, this inquiry isn't going to solve everything, but I do think we need it. I do think we need to know far more of what the orders were given to the army, what happened after the invasion, Abu Ghraib, Fallujah, prisoners, treatment. All those issues have got to come out.
Let's talk about some leaked documents that have appeared in some British papers, some military documents. British senior officers spent a significant amount of time in consenting and evading US orders to take military action against MUKHTAR al-Sadr. These were revealed in these documents. That's the powerful Shia militia leader in the south, and engaging in negotiation instead. Now, when American orders reached the British, they noted the intent but tended to ignore the details. The paper also said that Americans were resistant to dialogue to the point of arrogance, and dealing with them corporately is akin to dealing with a group of Martians. American commanders accused the British of appeasing the Shia militias in the south, while the British accused the Americans of resorting too readily to force in cities like Fallujah, that's up in the north. Now, recriminations eased after 2007, when General David Petraeus adopted new counter-insurgency tactics similar to those adopted by the British forces. Mr. Cole, what impact do you think those revelations are likely to have on US-UK relations in the light of this war?
Well, first thing to say is I think that is a slightly oversimplified picture of what was going on. Iraq is a large country, and things changed over time, not just when General Petraeus came in, but from the beginning, when I think there was a mistaken way that we went in through the process that we were there. Now, I hope that this will actually improve how the US and UK militaries and indeed other allied countries' militaries operate together. As I say, there were mistakes made in Iraq, grievous mistakes. One of the points of this report, and something that I hope is not lost in a search to put Tony Blair on trial, is to look honestly at those mistakes and see, well, what went wrong, what went right, how do we learn from that, and how do we actually, given that we are likely to be involved in, at least in Afghanistan for some time to come, how do we make sure that those mistakes don't happen again? How do we make sure that we are learning from what's happened in the past and we don't repeat those mistakes? So I hope that if this is an honest, thoroughgoing and broad-ranging inquiry, and not just looking at a few headline issues, we'll actually get an improvement in those sort of relations.
Mr. Al-Mukhtar, what do you think the legal ramifications, if there are any, of those leaked reports will have on the US? Might it open up more investigations, or will people call for more further investigations into their role in the war and their relationship with Britain?
I doubt very much. We may have one journalist or another go on a hunt mission and take one of the issues and pursue it a little further. But the way it's going to go, I think, is that most of these leaks will be, nobody is going to challenge them, nobody is going to do anything about them, and within a week or weeks it will disappear. However, I think in terms of the inquiry itself, it may assist the inquiry in looking particularly at particular documents, or paying more attention to the details of some of the documents because they were highlighted by people from outside the system. So when the journalists leaked the documents and they highlighted various issues in them, this may bring to the attention of the inquiry itself some of these points and point the torchlight on these issues. But I don't think genuinely it will have much effect on the legality or otherwise, or indeed even on the proceedings of the inquiry.
Mr. Corbyn, ahead of this, more leaked reports about how badly prepared Britain was, interviews from relatives just talking about the harsh conditions under which some of the British soldiers worked. What are you hearing about the British victims and their families? How are they viewing this case, and what do they want to get out of it?
Well, there are two issues here. There's the legality of the orders that were given to British and American soldiers of what they should do, the hooding of prisoners, the treatment of people, the assault on Fallujah. That is a huge issue, and there is some legal action being prepared in Iraq, and possibly legal action will follow here. The other side of it is the British soldiers themselves, that many of whom appear to have been quite unprepared for it, many of whom were very frightened and quite terrified whilst they were there, and tragically many of those who lost their lives. I've spoken to soldiers that have come back who were frightened by the experience there, and they weren't clear why they were there, and many of them have come back very angry about the whole thing, felt they were misled into the war, and tragically so many of them lost their lives. Their families are very angry. The attitude of the British military towards the blind following of the British government's views on Iraq or Afghanistan of other things has changed fundamentally as a result of this. Military families now take part in demonstrations, speak out in demonstrations against these conflicts and these wars. And so I think it's had a political change, and there will quite possibly be big legal ramifications, not just in Iraq and Britain, but there's also, of course, which we've perhaps passed on from now, but the legal implications of the so-called humanitarian intervention. The war was illegal from the very beginning. That we should remember.
And what about, Mr. Al-Mukhtar, the action of some British forces against Iraqis? I mean, there have been accusations of murder, rape and torture. How do you hope this inquiry will deal with that?
Well, I don't think it is within the remit of the inquiry, but I am a little bit distressed that the judicial process in the UK has not been dealing with these complaints in the proper way that English courts would deal with such issues. We've seen pictures of people being kicked and treated, maltreated, but yet at the end of the day we have not seen many people who were found guilty. To try and rely on the idea of the military courts or whatever other means that are available to the lawyers, I think it doesn't do British justice justice, and it doesn't do Britain the role that we should all look at an honourable country which looks at the rule of law and does not distinguish between abuses of human rights, whether they are in a state of war or not, or whether they are civilians or military or whatever. So as far as the Iraqis who were abused and misused in Iraq by the British soldiers, and I think there is ample evidence that has come forward, it should go to the proper channels in the courts here, and people should be found to be guilty, not because there is vengeance in the idea, but because people must understand that the law, no one is above the law, whether they are doing a military duty, whether they are ethical or not, whether they are serving dictators or democracies. Rule of law is rule of law, and justice is justice, and fairness must prevail in all circumstances. I look forward to the day that we here in Britain actually look at some of the soldiers' actions, and the government and the military have said there are bad apples. Let's assume there are bad apples rather than a systematic way of misbehavior. Those bad apples must be brought to justice, must be made examples, because the world calls on Britain to play a major role in a variety of places, not only in Iraq and Afghanistan, but it is called upon to do quite a lot of work in many other countries. And I think we owe it to our soldiers, we owe it to the British public, that we must be upholding the rule of law. We must be acting in a moral, ethical and a legal manner, whether we are at war or not.
Okay, Mr. Cole, the results of the finding, or the findings rather, will only be found out after elections. Why do you think that call was made? Who's that to protect, the British public or the government itself?
Actually, that's not quite what's been said. Gordon Brown said he didn't expect he would report before the next election. Since then, Sir John Chilcot has said he'll be reporting towards the end of 2010. That being because we're looking at a period from 2001 through 2009. There's a lot of evidence, a lot of interviews, a lot to do. If this is going to be done properly, it can't be done, you know, to meet an artificial deadline of the election. It was never going to make the middle of next year or the earlier part of next year. It needs to take as long as it needs to take. I don't really think suggesting that this has been done to protect somebody is particularly accurate or particularly helpful, to be honest.
Not suggesting, just asking. Mr. Corbyn, what do you think the legacy of this war will be? What do you think the inquiry will find as far as that is concerned?
I hope it will challenge the whole idea of the impunity of any forces. Indeed, British courts already challenge that. We've taken for ourselves universal jurisdiction on human rights matters. I think the legacy will be that Parliament was misled and deceived, that the information was withheld that should have been forthcoming, and the war itself was fundamentally illegal. I hope it will challenge the whole concept of unilateral so-called humanitarian intervention, which brings about such humanitarian disaster as has happened in Iraq, and I hope that those that led us into the war will pay the legal price for it.
We'll certainly be keeping an eye on this inquiry. Mr. Corbyn, thank you very much for talking to us. Mr. Cole, and you too, Mr. Al-Mukhtar, thank you very much for your thoughts on this subject. And of course, Thank you always for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Goodbye and thanks very much for watching.